Good morning. You're listening to Central Wisconsin's 24-hour information station, AM 1320 WFHR. It's time now for the Morning Magazine, brought to you by Comfort Air Heating, Cooling, Plumbing. Now, with the Morning Magazine, here's Carl Hilke.
Thank you, Jerry, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's show on AM 1320 and streaming live at WFHR.com. We also welcome our buddy Jesse from Wisconsin Rapids Community Media. He's here recording us in high definition for viewing on their fine website or on your local public access channel, whether it be Spectrum or Solaris. And the reason why he's here, it's time for our monthly visit with Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink. And the mayor and I were just mentioning was telling the mayor that Congressman Kind had offered his hello to you, but it turns out you two met at the because he was heading over to the American Heroes Cafe, and you both went over there. And I hear. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but there's a project that they're asking the vets to get involved with in terms of recording their history, right. and which I find very interesting.
Yeah, we made him aware of the program that River Cities or Wisconsin Rapids Community Media airs, and that's the Heroes Stories series. And so he was pretty excited to hear about that project because it would fit right in with their objectives with the project that he's working on.
Okay, so we got... It's not a really good weather forecast. When
I almost heard you say the S word.
Yeah, no, I know.
2 to 3 inches of what?
Rain. Yeah, rain.
Right? Okay.
But we don't need rain.
Yeah, we don't.
And we have wind damage from the other day. Mm-hmm. So if we get bad weather, how is that going to affect the city? I mean, I noticed a bunch of tree damage already around the city from the severe storm that hit the other night.
Yeah, and our crews were working throughout the night that night because some of the trees were actually in the street, in the right of way or in the street. So they were actually working throughout the night. I know I'm in the neighborhood where there was a lot of straight line winds, and it quite surprised me because I was out for dinner and came back home and was surprised to see the leaves. It looked like it had hailed or something with all the leaves that were down, but definitely the heavy rain. But yeah, you're right. We don't need a lot more rain. But I would mention on the note of a storm cleanup is folks that are looking to have large limbs or branches removed by the city. Next week is our regularly scheduled brush pickup week. So as a reminder to our listeners, the procedures are essentially to place your brush at the curb by Monday morning, because then our crews run the garbage routes throughout the week. So if you don't get it out by Monday, there's a chance that it may not get picked up.
Okay, you mentioned, too, it was nice to have the timing on the new timing system working on the expressway. Why don't you talk a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's coming from Heroes Cafe and the Crossview Church from the former Shopko Plaza Mall. And one of those, I don't always drive the network. I'm getting off on a side street. But today was one of those days where I drove from 8th Street all the way across town. And I had green lights the entire way, Carl. I didn't have to stop. And it was in large part, and it might have been coincidental, but in large part because the city just installed all the new timing for the expressway. So folks that talk about not being able to get through the expressway, it was the first time in over a decade that we had applied and analyzed the traffic volume and traffic patterns to better time the system. So that's the amount of green that you get when you're going through the expressway. Now, just as a reminder, you're not always going to get that because if someone triggers the pedestrian walk sign, or if there's some of the intersections are actuated, meaning folks that pull up on a side street may trigger the light. So there are some variables there that get affected, but ultimately it was nice to see that pat ourselves on the back a little bit because getting through the expressway is the intent of the expressway, not to stop traffic but to keep the through traffic moving.
Let's get into we all know what's going on the west side with the Midwinter Foundation eliminating those buildings, and the city would like to see some development. There's some discussion. Could you give us an update? Everybody's wondering, okay, what's next?
Sure. Well, and I think I'm glad that you gave some background and some history. The Midwinter Foundation has been acquiring properties in that block since the 90s, and they've had a long-standing vision to do something what they believe would be very beneficial to the community. Previously, it was a large theater. The Consolidated Papers Foundation had desired to put in a large theater in that block. Now, they didn't own all the property at the time. The sale of the mill at the time, there was a confluence of things that happened that resulted in them not building or developing that block. Not to mention the fact that there's still other property owners in that block too. So there's a couple of components that the Midwinter Foundation is obviously now with the demolition of the buildings. We're very sad to see some historical structures disappear from our downtown. Forever the landscape will be different. So without question, this is a dividing line, really in the span of history of our community as people think about what the look of the downtown is. And our conversations really have been, one, I think it's important to remember all that similar, not all that different in the triangle block, and that is the removal of structures and the clearing of property is such an important step to readying something for reuse. Now, it may not be that a developer is in tow and they're going to break ground that next construction season, but that's a major barrier, a cost that to be removed for a developer to redevelop a property. So the conversations we've had with the Midwinter Foundation have been surrounding that. One, they had a desire to remove the structures that they had deemed irreparable or beyond their useful life. And so those are the four buildings, really. It's the former cultural center that's no longer, Church's Drug, which is moving next, as well as the Book World, and the small little book nook next to the Venus Gentlemen's Club. Those structures all be removed in this process. And on an interim basis, our ordinance requires them to not leave a big hole, so they'll have to fill in and seed the property, so it'll be green grass. But on a long-term basis, it is my hope and my understanding that property is available for redevelopment. And redevelopment in what form, we don't know. We've talked about concepts not all that different than what we've talked about with the Triangle project on air with you and our listeners' benefit, and that was a first floor retail or commercial activity, could be office space, could be retail stores, and then upper floors residential. And it fits with the city's vision, certainly, if that is the case, because we want to see more people living downtown. When more people live downtown, more businesses can survive and thrive downtown. That's the case in every community that's undertaking downtown development efforts. So, that's our hope and that's our understanding. Now, if somebody comes along with another better idea, the foundation may be receptive to it. I do know that if folks have interest in developing that property locally or outside the area, that the property is available for redevelopment.
And I should mention, for full disclosure purposes, we have offered time on this program to the foundation to describe their vision whenever they want to sit down and talk about it, and we're more than willing to let them talk about it. I think that's only fair. So and that's an open invitation. Whenever they are ready to talk about it, we're here to listen. Yeah,
and I think the city is working with them as we work with every property owner, right? That city doesn't own a lot of property. I mean, in terms of developable property, we have a fair amount, but we don't own it all. A lot of it's held by private interests and private individuals, and we work with all of them on different stages and different levels. If they come to us and express a desire to market it, and we've got people maybe saying we'd like to do a project in the city of X nature, well, we help them do site selection, right? And so that would be no different in this case, that we'd like to see development happen. I'd very much love to see a development happen in my tenure, because I don't want to be known as the person that had seen demolition, a significant amount of demolition in my time, and I'll be the first to admit that in order for progress to happen, sometimes a casualty or consequence is demolition, right? You've got to pave way for new development. The YMCA is no different, right? Mm-hmm. A majority of the Rapids Mall will be torn down with the redevelopment of and the relocation of the VA and the YMCA-Boys and Girls Club. So, and while it's it's nostalgic, we can look back and reflect on some of that history. That's the consequence of progress.
Since you mentioned that the YMCA Boys and Girls project, the role the city will play, how is this going to be developed, and how is this going to affect the downtown?
Well, it'll certainly have impact. I mean, there's expected to have over 300 contractors at various points during the project working downtown. So that's an influx and a confluence of demand for goods and services, restaurants, et cetera, right? So that's an exciting impact note, I would say, not to mention just the amount of investment, right? That area businesses and suppliers that are in the construction space will have an opportunity to supply to that project. So there's also that benefit, and that's the multiplier effect, right, that you get through construction. And then ultimately, when it's open in the spring of 2020, which is hard to believe it's that far off, it'll be here before we know it. But January or early 2020, when that project opens, there will be a major influx of traffic again, and it's our hope and our belief that that'll spur demand for other businesses to open and locate near the project. So, on many levels, it's exciting, kind of in those modes. And then there's also property. When we talk about Midwinter Foundation owning a couple blocks downtown, and the YMCA now owning acres of property. I mean, not just blocks, but acres of property downtown that in many forms will not be used for the project. There are opportunities to seek development partners and redevelopment for those areas as well. In particular, the former gas station car wash and the restaurant area. Okay,
that area, and then there's that frontage property where you. Oh, what's going to happen with that?
Between Subway and the mall and former Yonkers, right? Yeah, so where the parking lot sits today, in front of the main entrance of the former mall, will be what they're going to bill as development opportunities.
Okay, then everyone's wondering when can we get rid of that ugly old foundry?
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of questions about that. It's next. I mean, on many levels, the city isn't involved directly in much on the west side of the river. That would be one project I could see the city, becoming interested in playing a role in. We're not going to buy it. It's not in our development plans today, but I know that the owners, as they get through the winding down of their operations, have expressed interest in working with the city on that. So it's our hope, that we can work something out. Those projects are great because the state likes to invest in those redevelopments because you're taking something that's kind of ugly maybe and blighted and doing something much different and probably more beneficial to the downtown and surrounding area. So that's another project that we'd like to see some activity on.
And if you're just joining us on the Morning Magazine, welcome. It's our monthly visit with Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink, and you're invited to, if you have a question for the mayor, to call in at 715-424-2600. I got a call yesterday on Over the Back Fence. What's going on with Dunkin Donuts? And then another contractor called in after the show. I guess they have two different the building itself that just went up has one contractor, and then there's going to be a second contractor for the interior. Is that what
correct? Yeah, they use somebody that's knows their brand, that does kind of their brand rollout. So that's why you don't see any branding or signage. There wouldn't be any fixtures inside. So yeah, they're correct that somebody, it's because actually the property owner is owning the building, and Dunkin will lease that, right? So that's the handoff now. So they've done all the site work that needs to happen. There's more that needs to, kind of the finishing work. And I haven't seen a schedule. I know they were talking about fall. It's not, it's probably could have been a quick project, but I think because of the dynamic with the two contractors and fitting that project into somebody else's schedule is kind of what we're seeing with the hurry up and wait kind of situation.
And it's amazing in this town. The rumors start flying. They're not coming now. Or come on. Use some common sense here. Right. They're not going to build a building and just...
Our patience, right? I have learned a tremendous amount of patience in this role, that things just don't, no matter how much effort you can apply, there's always something that either pops up or there's a good reason why things take longer than they do. We're working on deals that right now, just to give folks a sense, people that are looking at making some significant investments in town, their schedule is months, if not a year out before they would begin doing anything with that property that, say, they might buy this fall. Financing has to get in place. They've got to do market studies oftentimes, or they've got to do other analysis of to sell their project to somebody else that might be working with them on a project. So I'm hoping that over the next month and a half, some properties will change hands, and we can talk about that. But just to give folks a sense, there is a major lead time before anything happens, not to mention shovels in the ground, because there's a whole design phase, right? Mm-hmm. All the work that's happening at the hospital, or even let's take the YMCA for an example, those projects take a year to two to design, to just get construction documents drawn up, just to get the schematic design out of the way. Very labor-intensive processes, especially on big projects. So not all the different than the Aquatic Center, right? It took us over a year to address all of the components that go into design. So while I'd love to have a ton of announcements all the time, things just take time.
Okay. And I guess we have to learn the value of patience.
Right.
Like they say, patience, children.
Right. Yes. We're taught that very early, and sometimes we got to be reminded of it.
Since we're talking about redevelopment, anything new on the Triangle project? Or?
The developer was in town, 3 weeks ago, I guess now. Yesterday, we had at our Finance and Property Committee a discussion in closed session about it. I guess what I can share on air publicly is the developer remains engaged. Gorman and Company still remains at the table. They're just as confident and as excited about the project as they were when they first came to the market, probably even more so now, as they've really spent time to understand the demand for the product that they're bringing to the community. And even further, because we hope to leverage other federal and other financing vehicles, it allows us to get into those pipelines, where before, if we were to just move forward with the project, the city's TIF might have had to bear more of the cost, other financiers. So if we can use some other tools, that'll help lower the project cost for ultimately the community or the developer.
Any timeline on when they might complete the acquisition of property?
Property acquisition is the remaining component that physically needs to occur before construction happens, right? And of course, design and everything else. But they would put a rendering out if they knew how much property they had to work with. Now, the 3 parcels that remain, 4 stools, and the 2 Giebert properties are all that remains. We can work without them. The reality is, from a community benefit and a tax base potential, the city can, and for the benefit of all of our taxpayers, the city can achieve a better return on its investment with all of the property versus a fraction of it.
And if push came to shove, could the city accelerate that by just saying, listen, we're going to condemn?
There are other options. Yeah, condemnation, eminent domain. There's a couple of other
it's
tools.
A TIF you can use.
Yeah. We're seeing it now with Foxconn. They're really testing the limits for how they're telling people that their brand new home is blighted or it needs to be acquired for public purposes. Yeah, they're testing.
I know you as a public official, you don't like to do that, but at some point, you got to say, come on.
And oftentimes, if you look back at those instances where those tools were used, you end up where you started. Very close, if not where you started, in terms of your original purchase, your offer to purchase, because of your legal fees and the time that gets consumed or lost. So nobody wants to go through those ugly battles, right? And the city doesn't want to either. So it's our hope that for the benefit of the economic success of the community, that we can acquire those properties and move forward.
We got our first caller of the morning, and so why don't we let them thank you for waiting. You're on the Morning Magazine with Mayor Vruwink.
Yes, good morning, Mayor.
Good morning.
And good morning, Carl. Could you, Mayor, explain to me, I did listen to your council meeting last night, and explain to me the last referral that came in, or request from Encourage to have the council sign on to... I didn't understand it at all. It came from Alderman
Koth, I believe, right?
Koth, and then, yes. And what were they asking of the actual, were they just, Encourage was asking to sign on to some project for the Tribune Building, but I didn't understand the wording, and I'll listen off air, and you can maybe explain it to us. And can you also explain that, or at least be certain that we as taxpayers, when we dial 911, we will have somebody within a matter of minutes, if possible, to our properties or to our needs. And this really scares me with this 30 minutes or 30 miles out for residency. Why are they considered emergency workers when that's no emergency at all? When you have to drive 30 minutes, maybe a train, an accident on their part coming in, it just seems craziness. But I will listen off air, and you can clarify for all of us.
Thanks for the call.
Okay.
I can tell you, as far as I understand with Alderperson's referral, and that's why I hope to clarify this referral process, because to get an audio or a verbal referral doesn't give us the scope and the scale at which these aldermen want activity or action on things. So it's a bit challenging for city staff and I to respond or provide background information and then ultimately put forth a something for them to choose or to vote up or down. But in terms of Alderman Coast's referral, it's my understanding that Encourage has taken the time to meet with alderpersons to offer those that hadn't had a tour of the building before to get a tour. At least that's the information that Alderman Coast shared last night. And it sounds as if Encourage has asked the aldermen, and I don't know if it's asked them all, and it wasn't in their conversations, and just learned yesterday that they had been reaching out and having these discussions with aldermen. It sounds as if it'd be a non-binding resolution of support, is the way I interpreted Alderman Coast's request. Now, I haven't seen any draft. I haven't seen any components of what that looks like.
Well, I can give what little background I have on some of this is that there's a push for some state funding, which sources tell me might be announced fairly soon.
Okay.
And maybe that is part of the process. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, they're obviously in development of capital, at least grant funding. They've
From what I understood, what was told me, my source said the announcement would come from the governor's office.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I think it as was the case with the previous state solicitation that they had sought from the governor in the state legislature in the state budget was just that they were looking for first money in because they hadn't received any substantial grants to begin any sort of construction activity. That it's my understanding they need $4 million to unlock, to secure basically the debt financing and then, to move forward. So I'm not sure what Alderman Coath ultimately, or what the aldermen really want to see from us in that resolution. So unless maybe the Encourage is going to furnish something for us to consider and debate, but so that's my information.
It's basically a statement of support,
right? Yeah, we do some non-binding resolutions on various state issues occasionally, and so I'm assuming that's what that's related
now,
to.
I was a little confused with this what you had talked about emergency personnel.
Yeah, well,
especially since we have our fire department and stay.
Yeah, I'll address some of the caller's concerns. So this city council, through a referral made by Alderman Blazer, who really wishes the city would liberalize its residency requirements. So over time, the city has adjusted its residency requirements for city employees, and within the current administration in the state, they've really handcuffed the city about how restrictive we can be with residency requirements. I tend to be a very pro-residency guy. I want folks that work for the city or the school district or the county to live a reasonable distance from where they work. Now, the reality is a little bit different, and I understand that there's a lot of reasons why people live where they live: family roots, family ties, housing options, cost of living. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. So essentially, the referral was to make the residency requirements 30 miles from the boundaries of the city. And if you draw 30 miles, I guess as the crow flies, you can get sometimes 40, 45 minutes from our boundary where you can actually have your residence, which is, a hike. I think I live 3-4 minutes from work. So I guess that's a long way for me to drive, and that's all relative. Some folks may do it every day or longer and it doesn't bother them. But in terms of the emergency response, you're right. We do have firemen on 24-hour shifts, and so they're at the station. The issue comes in when someone calls in sick, when there is a major incident, a fire, a structure fire, or any other
mutual assistance.
Yeah, mutual assistance, where we need to up our manning, and so we have to call people in. And so the thought was that the police and fire chiefs, could establish some additional residency requirements within that pertaining to emergency response. Historically, we've also put in our department heads have to live a little closer than the rest of the employees, and I believe that's really important in the cases of emergency or disaster preparedness or response, because not that you need everybody at City Hall, but you need everyone a reasonable distance from the place where they work, right? So the city council, the committee, the HR committee approved liberalizing sort of the residency requirements further than what they are, and the council decided to postpone them last night because they actually it's a subject of bargaining, and we're beginning to negotiate union contracts with the police and fire unions on the particular issue, on a whole host of issues, one of which may end up being a piece of part of the residency issue. So I'm not sure where it's going to go. I believe the council would have approved it last night if it wasn't something that it would have affected union negotiations. And I think on the flip side, we do have some issues of establishing eligibility lists for police and fire officers, police officers and firemen and women that our eligibility lists are very short. And a lot of communities around the state are struggling to get people to apply or to go through the academies of various programs to become eligible on a list for us to hire them. Our lists have one or two, and those folks don't necessarily always score the best. So we'd like to have a good number of people to choose from.
Is residency one of the issues?
Well, that's potentially one of the concerns, is that residency. Now, that's where actually we've got some folks in our fire department in particular that have family ties east of Wisconsin Rapids, and they may receive property as a gift, and they want to build there, or want to live there, close to family perhaps. So the residency requirement would put people out in Custer or east of Amherst or Wapaka. So it's a bit of a distance. From a relatively speaking, it's far from me, but again, don't ask me because I live in town.
And then you got the state requirements,
right?
Yeah, the state basically said. Got rid of requirements, didn't it?
Yeah, it was an attack really on Milwaukee, that folks wanted to live outside Milwaukee, and the city wanted folks to live in Milwaukee for various reasons, keep tax dollars flowing, keep the tax base. And that was through the downturn, I think, the housing market really, where they saw that effect, and the state came in and said, no, you don't have to live in the city of Milwaukee anymore. And then the rest of the state kind of got pulled into that deal.
Okay. We got to take our first break. You're listening to The Morning Magazine on AM 1320 and streaming live at WFHR.com. We also welcome our friends from Wisconsin Rapids Community Media.
Good morning and welcome back to The Morning Magazine, presented by Comfort Air Heating, Cooling, Plumbing. It's time for part 2. Once again, here's Carl Hilke.
Thank you, Jerry, and welcome back, everybody, to today's show on AM 1320 and streaming live at WFHR.com. We also welcome our buddy Jesse from Wisconsin Rapids Community Media. You can view this program in high definition on their fine website or on your public access channel, whether it be Spectrum or Solaris. And the reason why he's here is our monthly visit with Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink. Mayor, one of the items under new business at Common Council last night was a resolution approving the filing of an objection to an appeal by Verso Corporation of manufacturing assessments for 3 parcels of property in the city. Mm-hmm. Now, this has been a recurring theme, and it's not just in this city, but in cities across the state when it comes to manufacturing properties.
That's right, manufacturing and commercial alike, where property owners can file an objection to the state. Now, in Wisconsin, the state assesses all manufacturing properties, so there's more of an equalized basis than just local assessors performing an opinion of valuation, right? So in Wisconsin, or in Wisconsin Rapids in particular, there was a lot of manufacturing properties. Look at the industrial parks, Verso, the paper company being a large, very large portion of the manufacturing class of property. And this isn't the first time that property has seen this kind of rodeo, I would say. But the city formally approved an objection to Verso's objection of their assessment. So what that means is Verso said to the state, we believe our mill or our parcels of property are overassessed. In fact, they're in public records that were included and shared last night. They believe that the mill is worth half of what it is today. And so, of course, the city would, as a party to that and concerned party, would say, well, we object to Verso's objection.
Okay.
So essentially, we can then become apprised. We're a party in sort of all of the information that gets shared as to the proceedings that will go on with the state's review of that assessment of that property. So, it's very concerning to us because if they were awarded this devaluation just on the basis of what they objected, it results in about $600,000 of city of tax dollars to the city. I mean, that's very substantial. We're seeing it all across the state. Fortunately, we don't have a density or a great population of Walmarts and the big box retailers, but cities all across Wisconsin are being faced with this same issue, that Walgreens, it's called the dark store loophole or the dark store case, where Walgreens filed a case and won that they believe their assessment should be compared to a dark retail store down the road, where many of us believe, well, no, that's a Walgreens, it's operating, it's profitable, all of that. It's not all that different in this case here in the industrial space, in the manufacturing space, because Verso says, well, our market is soft and we've had a lot of imports dumped in the market and the price of paper, this, that, and the next thing. So they believe, that their business or their property is worth that much less. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because this isn't the first time. New Page filed it previously with the state. They were awarded an adjustment to their assessment. It wasn't as substantial as this. I mean, there was nothing close to 50%. So in effect, they would be taking $32 million, or so $42 million in having that. So they're saying the mill's worth $21 million, not $42 million. So that's a big thing. The good news to taxpayers is, that we're objecting to this, and we hope that if they're awarded anything, it's far less than what they objected to. The tough thing is, these companies hire these tax attorneys around out of Milwaukee in this case, to fight these assessments in Wisconsin. And because the state legislature last session didn't address this issue, despite a bipartisan proposal that the governor supported, in terms of bipartisan, one of the houses, the assembly, didn't support taking up the bill. So here we are left with more of these things. Now, I can't say that would have addressed exactly what Verso's going for here, because they're applying for, the market pressures and all of that. But the tough part is this is a tax shift. From, it's not that the tax levy, our budgets don't get decreased. We transfer that assessment to everyone else. So it's a big concern. So I sure hope that listeners contact their elected representatives in the state to let them know that this is a concern, and obviously it's happening around the state, so it's not unique to this community, and that they could call a special session and address this situation if they felt strongly enough about it.
Well, yeah, if there's agreement that this is a bad loophole and it's screwing taxpayers, why don't we address it? Right. How would this legislation work? How would it address this loophole that allows for this?
Well, it closes that loophole, so you can't use those vacant properties.
Sales,
yeah, right. And assessors have a couple of ways of assessing property. We talked about that on the whole revaluation conversations, right? And, in commercial or industrial, I don't know how the state does manufacturing exactly, but, on commercial, it's kind of an income approach, or, there's a couple of varieties that they use to come up with a fair assessment as the assessor sees. And so in the dark store case, they would close the dark store loophole, and they wouldn't be able to claim that those dark stores are worth the same as their operating vibrant retail store might be. Wisconsin Rapids, fortunately, we were fairly conservative with our assessment on Home Depot, Walmart, and CVS and Walgreens, but those are really the four, or Shopko probably, or Cops could also file an assessment. But the grand scheme of things, now fortunately we don't have the Menards, the Lowe's, all those others that some cities have assessed them, and they've had to write rebate checks back to John Menard in Menard's case, or to Lowe's Corporation or Kohl's. Those were the big folks. So on some people say, well, why don't you have more retail? I'm glad that the city doesn't have a large concentration of retail in its city, because they could be fighting and winning at this battle, and the rest of the taxpayers in the city would be paying more.
And basically, this amounts to, this is a state issue. This is something the state has to fix.
Right.
And you said there's a bipartisan agreement from the governor on down, so let's get it done.
Yeah, that's part of a bigger issue, right? A countywide assessment that, if we're trying to equalize values and hold things true and fair and all of that, there could be better ways to assessing property in the state of Wisconsin. But those are political hot potatoes, right? Manufacturers and Commerce, the largest lobby in Wisconsin, is very much against closing the dark store loophole, because their members benefit from having that legislative loophole, and the case that was awarded, in the Supreme Court case that was given in Walgreens' favor. So, it's unfortunate, because we believe in everybody's in equity and fairness, and everybody should pay their fair share. And unfortunately, in these instances, it could be a big tax shift to everyone else that pays property taxes.
I mean, since we're talking numbers, what are we looking at right now in terms of the next city budget?
So we were given, as we talk a lot about, budget preparation and past shows, the city was given the magic number this year is about 1.39, not about, it's 1.39% is the number which the city, new money that the city can work with legally under Wisconsin law. So what that means is our budget can only grow 1.39% to be exact. And so we have to fit everything we're doing today within that box. So that means any new wage increases, any new projects, any new operational initiatives all have to fit within that 1% increase. Otherwise, legally, we're not compliant with state law. So many departments have submitted their budgets. We're still waiting for a few more. And so we're working on, we've been meeting with departments already, and we'll have a budget to the council in October, and will be approved in November. So in terms of outside of borrowing, and I'll mention that, our budget can grow 1% or percent and just under a half. But if we have borrowing initiatives, that's outside of that 1%. So our street construction projects we generally borrow for, other public works improvement projects receive debt service, so that's where people see the impact to their tax bill ultimately.
How is the budget reforms you initiated when you became mayor with more of an activity-based budgeting? How is that affected by this? And
well, I think it's helped department heads decide what's a priority, right? When we try to add something new to our operations, you have to cut somewhere else. I mean, or do it more efficiently or cheaper, right? And so I think just the activity nature, and it doesn't work everywhere in every department, but we've talked about in the simple terms. Take brush pickup for example.
Sure.
The amount of resources it takes for us to do that service every month that we do it. If we don't analyze the costs of it, we're never going to move those dollars into road maintenance, for example. So I think we've done a much better job at analyzing costs. We're not quite there to the extent where I'm satisfied, because I believe we can be tracking more of our activities and ultimately having a debate. We're having a good debate now in garbage pickup, for example. Mm-hmm. What are the things that we want to continue to do in the area of garbage pickup that we may or may not want to continue to do because they're too costly or they're too prone to injury, like the bulk item pickups, the fact that we're picking up couches and rolls of carpet and toilets and everything else. Some of those activities really are outside the scope of the city's regular garbage collection.
Yeah, I would think
for
so.
You and I and everyone else that lives in the city. So we're looking at that because right now that's a cost to the city, and moving those dollars potentially into more road maintenance. That it would be a great benefit if we could free up some resources to do other things, right? So as it pertains to the budget, some of that information is being worked to fit into the budget, so we can potentially. The problem is you don't always know how much you're saving until you get through the year. So there's always a lag time to reapplying those resources elsewhere.
And you're about to enter a season which can blow up budgets.
That's right.
That's we're talking about the winter season, when we're talking snow removal and treatment of roads and the like. You get a bad winter, and that blows up your budget real quick.
Yeah, even small events, right?
Yeah.
Last winter we had very small snow events. Earlier in the season, ice events. Those are very expensive because you just can't ignore the ice event, right? You've got to get out there and treat it. So if you get enough of those in a short, in a duration of the winter, that'll really blow your costs out of the water. And I think for us, our budgeting practices on snow removal are right on, in the sense that we're setting aside all of those dollars that we don't spend on snow removal for subsequent years. Now, you get a really bad year, you blow your reserves, right? That's a major risk, and we had one of those a number of years ago. So we head into the season and hope for the best.
With that, we have to take our final break. You're listening to The Morning Magazine. Welcome back to the final segment of the Morning Magazine with Wisconsin Rapids Mayor Zach Vruwink. Let's talk about the airport, Your Honor. I guess there's some news happening. I noticed that there's a plane at the end of the runway.
Yeah, one of my guests this morning was going to be our airport manager, Jeremy, and unfortunately had a situation that sounded like a disabled aircraft, which is term for something a situation where they've got to, deal with something, a maintenance issue perhaps, and it sounds like there was a tire issue with one of the planes. So he couldn't join us this morning.
Okay. But everybody, if you've been by the airport, you're seeing that they're getting ready for the next improvements. This is the one that was financed by the most recent state budget, correct? Okay. So, and that will eventually lead to the closing of the airport while they do that work.
That's
correct?
right. So a couple of components of the work. One is airport or airplane parking, right? It's the apron, as we call it. We're over tripling the size of the apron. So as folks have seen these very large wingspan aircrafts fly into our airport and land and use the airport, you can only park so many of them without running out of room, because you can't park them nose to nose like you would park a car or something. So that's a big component of the investment is the apron. When you're dealing with very heavy aircraft, that pavement has to be very thick and meet certain standards. So that's all part of the state aid project, as you mentioned, Carl, that came through the state budget. The other component is a partial parallel taxiway. So in the case of that plane this morning, that was taxiwaying on the runway, when that plane has a situation and can't move or taxis off the runway or something, they shut down the runway. Now, as if they were taxiing on the taxiway, you can keep the runway open, perhaps. So those airplanes that are having to use that primary runway turn around at the end of it and then take off. With a taxiway, you have that parallel road, essentially, for the airplanes to taxi on. So that's another component to the project, is a partial parallel taxiway. And then the third component is what we call a mill and overlay of the primary runway. And so like we do a street, if you're going to take the top off of a street, you mill it, and then you apply the new pavement. That's what we're doing to the primary runway. So that'll prolong the life of that runway at least a decade. Because when that primary runway needs to be reconstructed, it's millions and millions of dollars. So this allowed us to stave off major reconstruction of that runway for a long period of time. It was also built to a certain standard that they don't build runways anymore. Ours is very wide, and we want to make sure that we can maintain that width because we're probably not going to get it back in a reconstruction situation. So those are really the three elements of the project. October 1st is on or around October 1st, the airport will be closed. So for the benefit of our neighboring airports, they're going to see all the traffic that we normally see. But it's an important closure because we need to get that runway resurfaced.
And when do you anticipate reopening the airport?
Up to a month. So it's likely that it'll be closed through the duration of the Gulf season unless we have a real mild late fall, winter.
Yeah, because Sand Valley will be closing around the 25th, 26th or something.
That sounds right, yeah. So it'll be closed and that's why we wanted to schedule it. We'd rather do that in the fall than for it to cure, so that way when the spring rolls around, we can be just open, and there's going to be construction next spring on the last portion of all of this investment, and that's the federal money to construct the rest of that taxiway. So the one that's the state is funding is only a portion of the taxiway. So the feds are kicking in, which we were surprised to see another $2 million come to the airport for the benefit of the entire taxiway.
So when it's all done, we'll have almost like a brand new airport.
All new pavement. And, the tough part for generation to come is all that pavement's going to age about the same time. So it's going to require a lot of maintenance, preventative maintenance, and planning for its ultimate replacement when that time comes. I probably won't be on this earth at that point unless maybe I'm very old at that point.
Okay. Moving forward, we have a big project next year, East Grand Avenue.
Right.
So what can you tell us about the plans for that, and what should people be prepared for?
There hasn't really been any new developments since we've talked about it in the past, other than we're debating negotiating with the DOT right now on the inclusion of some important streetscape features. So those would be benches, bike parking, landscaped areas, decorative poles, and stamped concrete. Generally, the interpretation around the state in that program was when they do projects that are in the downtown area, that those are eligible expenses. Well, they've decided that they interpret things differently now, and so I had issued a letter to the DOT and still have not heard a response from the DOT, which is unfortunate because that project's going to happen pretty soon, and we've got to decide or plan for our budget purposes if we're going to have to cover some of those costs that we weren't anticipating early on. So the risk could be it looks just like a plain roadway and doesn't have any of the nice streetscape elements that we had asked for originally.
Why are they fighting it? Or is it part of that reform just to do basic stuff?
Well, there is a component, as we saw around the state, where they were taking off the stamped concrete and the colors off the overpasses and things. And I believe it's not all that different than that effort. They also were saying it was federal money and they can't do that. Well, this is actually state money that was unencumbered from the feds. So we disagree with their interpretation. It'll play out. It's one of those battles that we fight every day, and the public doesn't quite see under the hood. And unfortunately, that's the reality.
And in the meantime, we got an election coming up, and that could change.
It's interesting to see as public opinion sways on issues, what becomes a priority for the state. I'll say that without getting into the politics of the detail, but I'm glad that the public is engaged. It seems, as we were in the last presidential, and obviously now heading into the governor's race and other races, it's really nice to see the public paying attention, voicing their opinions about what they think is important. And the city's going to do the same in areas that we have seen concern, or areas where, in particular, road aids. We haven't seen substantial. The road aids that the city has received haven't kept up with the costs to maintain them, right? So if we have a 2% cost increase every year, the road aids certainly don't index to 2% or match that increase. So in effect, we're doing less every year because of the money we receive from the state. So we hope that enough of my counterparts are speaking up, and I know they are around the state, to continue to get political pressure on the folks to raise revenues.
Well, it's the same old argument. What are we going to do to rebuild our roads and et cetera, and how we're going to pay for it?
Yeah, the public expects us to do it. They don't care how it's paid for, right? So it's the mayor's fault that the roads in Wisconsin Rapids are a certain state, right?
I had to do a realignment because I hit a rut in the street.
Yeah, and yes, to some degree, the city's charged with the responsibility of doing that. But when we're not allowed to raise revenue, unless we want to implement a wheel tax, which some cities, actually a lot more cities, I'm surprised, were successful in implementing wheel taxes than I expected folks to be willing to do. But when it comes to your roads, people are more apt to pay more money. And if it's not through property taxes, the new way now is through wheel taxes. And I'm not so sure what the public opinion is in Wisconsin Rapids for that issue.
Well, how does that work?
Essentially, you can adopt it at a county level, you can adopt it at a city level, but allows you to use that revenue then for specifically for transportation. I don't believe there's a lot of flexibility in other areas.
How much of a tax are you allowed to?
It's up to the jurisdiction. So $20 a car, $50 a car, whatever it is every year. I mean, it's a new fee then. I think you can sunset it, but then when you sunset it, what's going to replace the revenue, right, or the resources? Mm-hmm. But Appleton, a lot in the Fox Valley, some in the southern part of the state. We haven't seen them any, I don't believe, in central Wisconsin. I'd like to see if we do it, that the county consider it, not that the city would do it, because the folks that are using the roads are folks that live in the county, right, generally.
Right.
There are folks that are transients, but folks that are living here live within the county boundaries more so than they live in a city boundary.
Anything else before I let you go that you wanted to talk about?
Nothing. Well, I guess Beautification Council, I'd like to plug that group because they're passionate and they're dedicated individuals. They have been selected. Their video was selected. So go to the city's Facebook page and vote for the city's video, because then the group could win $1,500 for other beautification projects in the community.
No.
So that's one neat thing. A couple ribbon cuttings over the last month. Hosted one at Images and Ink downtown. They bought a building near Paul Gross Jewelers and did some nice improvements to it. Milkweed Market, the market inside ODC, just opened and held their ribbon cutting. And then a martial arts academy that's in the on Baker Street, or Baker Drive, I guess, that used to be in the mall. They relocated and are back in operation again. So there's a couple other things. This morning, issued a proclamation to folks that are with the Three Bridges nonprofit, which is recovery counseling. So folks that had previously been dealing with addiction, that are now in recovery, are providing coaching services to addicts and to those that might have received an overdose situation. So it was neat to hear about what they're doing in a very big way. In small numbers, I think people think that the drug epidemic is everywhere, but the city last month had 8 overdoses, 4 of which resulted in the issuance of Narcan, which allows for folks to recover much better from an overdose. And so those folks are now met with, or have the opportunity to meet with coaches to help move them to recovery situations. So it's exciting to see these efforts that the city is a part of with the police department, as well as other resources in the community, Aspirus, the county health department, human services, and others. So that's an important mention, I think, for folks that are wondering, what are we doing in the community for folks that are dealing with addiction or facing overdose situations?
Well, as always, sir, we appreciate the time. We'll talk again next month.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks to our listeners.
And with that, we'll wrap up this edition of the Morning Magazine on AM 1320 and WFHR.com. We also thank our friends at Wisconsin Rapids Community Media.